Since the war in Ukraine, it is clear that the Ukrainian army is facilitating a turnaround. Contrary to the opinions of war experts, the army of Volodymyr Zelensky continues to defend its territory against the Russian invader. The momentum of the offensive that began in July with the High March artillery raid in the south culminated last week with the operations of the Ukrainian armed forces against Crimea. While this situation has deeply affected the Kremlin, it triggered the great collapse of the Russian army, and Russian soldiers stationed in the south began to seek ways to flee Ukraine. At the same time, with the Ukrainian strategy of cursing and Crimea, the Russian army got stuck, and the initiative is now entirely in the hands of the Ukrainian army thanks to the gay liberation. The strategies successfully implemented by the Ukrainian armed forces in the south have gained the advantage to attack in the Donbass region using this advantage. The Ukrainian armed forces moved many special units and advanced weapon systems to the east and conducted a surprise raid on the Russian occupation troops. In the face of the Donbass offensive that began last week, many neighborhoods, including the main bases of Kojiro and Wagner, were airlifted to Russian army depots of maniacal origin. The Donbass region was the main target of the Russian army, but the Kremlin, stunned by the raid of surprise, tried to neutralize this advance by ordering Russian troops in the Donbass to safety. However, the Russian generals did not understand and did not show intelligence. The Ukrainian warriors were not as insipid as they could digest. The Russian offensive in the Donbass that resumed yesterday ended in a big disappointment. The Ukrainian armed forces were very disappointed by the failure of the offensive. Big disappointment, the Ukrainian armed forces pushed back the Russian troops in the Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, Bakhmut, and in the two southern directions. After the violent achievements that the Russian army received in the south, it was pushed back from at least 5 directions by the Ukrainian army in the east and suffered a heavy loss. In the latest report issued by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, it is stated that the conflicts in the volume and political directions are still ongoing. It is reported that there is still the imminence of Russian Donbass and airstrikes from the territory of the Republic of Belarus. Ukrainian defenders have inflicted heavy losses on the Russian army in various areas. In most of these areas, the Russian army represented a significant force in the first months of the war. However, the Russian army has drawn a picture far from this power. Recently, the Russian army tried to improve its tactical position near this caravan of stories but did not succeed and withdrew. The Russian army tried unsuccessfully to attack near Petrivka but suffered losses and withdrew. The Ukrainian defense soldiers repelled a Russian attack conditional near Dolina and Dmitrivka. The Russian troops tried to advance near Kodyma and Bakhmut but suffered losses and withdrew towards Avdiivka. Of course, this slows down the pace of the attack, but we do it deliberately, and we all know that this is not the case. Due to the weakening of military power, Russia has slowed down its military attacks, and they are trying to present this situation in a different way. On the subject, the defense minister of Ukraine mocked what the defense minister of Russia said. The king of goodwill gestures announced today that the invaders were deliberately slowing down the campaign in Ukraine. We promise to do our best to monitor this slowdown into an old-fashioned withdrawal or a reverse attack, as the Russians like to call it. Statements have been included that the Ukrainians will expel the Russians from their lands as they did half a century ago. The depression of Russian military forces is tried to be completed by Putin. However, this trouble is vain. It is seen as a picture of Russian despair. It is understood that Vladimir Putin used firearms and submunitions weapons to defend himself. It is understood that Vladimir Putin used Russian prisoners as soldiers for the Ukrainian war in a desperate condition to mitigate the heavy losses on the Russian side. The Russian president let prisoners fight in the Ukrainian war to make up for the heavy toll on his army. According to Ukraine, Moscow demands are now visiting the incarcerations after about 45,000 Russians were killed. The prisoners are promised freedom and their families. We must question both the safety and effectiveness of Russia's deployment of criminals in the war in Ukraine. Do the Russians near the border lines want real convicts to go free because it won't look good? Criminals are convicted when they go to rape and pillage. They go to rape and pillage in another Ukrainian city and they knew that they would spread all over the world. Would they want that? But the other thing is that they're going to get into trouble. They're not going to be well trained, they're going to be very badly motivated. Many reports show us that the Russian army has documented the conscription of prisoners during the conflict and the rewards, including freedom and money. This army is not reliable. Russian commanders are very furious at Putin on this issue. However, because Putin thinks he has no other choice, he chooses this path. The presence of such criminals in the army makes other soldiers nervous. They know that any discriminating moment can also take action against them. At the same time, it is indicated in intelligence reports that these prisoners do not obey the feedback system. Russia, on the other hand, cannot encourage losses, no matter how many soldiers it sends to the region. The number of people who think that the Russian army in Ukraine is nothing more than a dried-up crowd is quite high. Even the separatists in the Donbass region complain about the incompetence of the Russians, the incompetence of Russian soldiers, the Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand. Do not hesitate to punish them. The Ukrainian General Staff said that 150 Russian soldiers were killed in a single attack the other day. The armed forces of Ukraine said in a statement that its army blocked the attacks of Russian forces on two major cities in the eastern interior region. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian forces tried to attack Bakhmut and Avdiivka with heavy weapons. Ukraine claims that nearly 46,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine since the war began. Anti-aircraft combat system statements also indicate that Russian tanks, warships, drones and cruise missiles have been destroyed by Ukrainian forces. We know that these losses are terrible figures for the Russian army even if Russia does not accept these losses. The situation at the front tells us everything. At the moment the Russian army sends all the T-64 tanks to the front. The rebellion of the soldiers who complain about the insufficient emulation and living conditions. The statements of the soldiers who fled the front are given to Ukraine. Help the channel to grow by liking the video, share the video around you. Don't forget to leave your point of view in comments.